you very much, Dr. Bishop. Ladies and gentlemen, let there be no mistake. Astronomy costs money, a lot of money. In the 20th century, astronomy became part of big science, the science of expensive technology and substantial budgets. Long past are the days when the study of the heavens was the domain of the eccentric, wealthy amateur or the recipient of princely patronage. Virtually all modern astronomers are on the state payroll one way or another, either as university professors or as government employees. In our roles as citizens and taxpayers, should we not inquire into the way in which our money is being expended and why? First, given that we live in an age obsessed with the bottom line, let's examine just how much money we're talking about. Whilst we cannot obtain exact figures, we can estimate the amount in a general way. You may immediately object that there are so few astronomers in Canada, the amounts cannot be significant. But you will be surprised. Almost all professional astronomers in Canada belong to the Canadian Astronomical Society, the Société Astronomique du Canada, or CASCA. In 1989, CASCA enrolled 264 full members, along with 63 graduate students. Table 1, if it works, shows the breakdown of the membership by sector, that is, whether astronomers are employed in educational institutions or in the government service, by which means we mean virtually to be employed by the National Research Council. The salaries for the professors come from the provincial coffers, for the latter, from the federal science budget. Note in the figures the lack of a private sector for astronomy. None of us will argue that astronomers are overpaid. Not much has changed since Robert Aitken of the Lick Observatory remarked to J.S. Plaskett during the Depression, quote, "We're having a lot of fun just now with bank holidays and so on. Happily, astronomers never have any money anyhow, so we're not very seriously inconvenienced," end quote. But big science means more than salaries. Table 2 shows an estimate for the fiscal year 1988-89 of the grants awarded to astronomers by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, or NSERC, along with the budget for federal activities in astronomy, space science, and related subjects. This includes the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics of the NRC, the Canadian Space Agency, and contributions to the Canada-France-Hawaii Telescope and the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope, both in Hawaii. Funding from NSERC, which is almost entirely allotted to university-based researchers in astronomy and space science, amounted to just under $2.5 million. Federal grants supported the operation of facilities across the country and in Chile. Thus, without even factoring in graduate fellowships and university research funds, we can see that the amount expended upon astronomy was almost $25 million. This does not include provincial funding for university-based astronomy. If we make a conservative estimate of, say, 200 faculty members, research assistants, postdoctoral workers, and technicians at an average salary of $40,000, we would reach $8 million without considering their substantial overheads, such as support staff, equipment, space, and benefits. This would give us a grand total in the neighborhood of $32 million. The equivalent American figures would be even more impressive. Not only is their astronomical community at least an order of magnitude larger than ours, they have more extensive and more expensive facilities. The amounts, at least to the unsympathetic taxpayer, would seem staggering. We've come a long way in the last century and a half. The Canadian government's first expenditure on astronomy was made in 1849 with a capital grant to construct the Quebec Observatory. By the time of Confederation, the annual appropriation for the Queen of the Sciences was about $3,000 a year, almost all of it for salaries. Canadian legislators of the time were a hard-nosed lot. The niggardly sums expended upon the sciences were always advanced on the understanding there was to be a payoff. The Geological Survey of Canada, for example, survived because its canny directors insisted that their work was necessary to discover Canada's mineral wealth. Agricultural and fisheries research were equally predicated upon their economic benefits to a growing country. And what of astronomical work? Not surprisingly, the meager grants were for the provision of accurate time and for the determination of longitudes and latitudes. Poor Commander Ash at Quebec lobbied for years to obtain a real telescope for his observatory. When he finally managed to obtain funds to purchase a modest refractor and to undertake some pioneering work in solar photography, he could not eke out enough from his grant to purchase plates and the chemicals to develop them. He retired a bitter man, and the observatory passed into oblivion. The Canadian astronomical community in the 19th century was so small that its members could literally have sat down to dinner together at the same table. That assumes that the Minister of Marine and Fisheries would have allowed them funds to travel to one place for dinner. He wouldn't have, of course. How times have changed. Nowadays, Canadian astronomers do sit down together for dinner in Canada and all over the world. Not only has the Canadian astronomical community changed almost beyond recognition, but its old raison d'etre has long since disappeared. When was the last time an astronomer in this country determined longitudes and latitudes? It has been many years since the physicists, with their atomic clocks, hijacked timekeeping from the astronomers. Do our astronomers do anything useful? Anything, that is, of an economic benefit to Canadians? It is best not to ask. Table 3 lists just a few of the titles of papers read to the last meeting of CASCA. If you were a legislator, what would you think? Assuming you understood it at all. The last one of all looks to me like a veterinarian's report at the Toronto Zoo. Naturally, you will object that this is all very unfair. Is particle physics practical? Is much of ongoing research in chemistry, biology, or the earth sciences? Indeed, no. But the advantage those scientists have is that they can argue that a practical benefit may lie down the road, if only they are supported financially. The cynic would note that almost any grant application in biology need only make a vague reference to a possible connection with a cure for cancer to ensure the requisite funding. Pity the poor astronomer whose fertile imagination can never stretch so far. Yet, Canadian astronomy is financed from the public purse, and we rarely, if ever, hear an objection. Have legislators changed so much since the 19th century? Yes, for the most part they have. And what about the taxpayers? They too appear to have benign thoughts concerning the funding of science. There are, to be sure, those who take exceptions to state support of the pursuit of knowledge. Several months ago, in my local community newspaper, one of the political analysts sneeringly called attention to some of the federal grants to sociological and historical research projects. As a social scientist, I took umbrage at his remarks because these projects appeared to me eminently appropriate research. Should I have penned a lecture on the importance of history for a civilized nation? No, one simply dismisses such intellectual Luddism as, hopefully, a momentary deviation from legendary Canadian tolerance. Many of you will remember, however, the irritating Golden Fleece Awards announced annually by Senator Proxmire to the American Congress. Is Washington that far from Ottawa in an intellectual sense? Let us suppose that a future finance minister, in search of profound budget cuts, egged on by a skeptical auditor general, discovers astronomy in his supply bill. What would we say if pressed to justify this support for astronomy? The chemist, the biologist, the earth scientist can all point to a pragmatic justification and reach for that hoary, if never demonstrated, belief that pure research always leads to practical application. Government scientific institutions were created with the practical payoff in mind. After all, our premier research organization, the National Research Council, was established to coordinate and encourage industrial research, not to undertake fundamental studies of nature. Parliament would not have voted funds to construct the splendid Sussex Drive laboratories in the depths of the Depression to underwrite pure research. The experimental farms and laboratories of the Agriculture Department were never intended to investigate the nature of life. They were created to help Canadian farmers to have a profitable business. Now, this is not to say that astronomical work could not lead to a practical result. Studies of asteroids now might help establish mining operations in the 22nd century. And theoretical studies of black holes could lead to a new energy source if we could locate and harness them. No finance minister would be persuaded. It is true that many astronomers are involved in the design and construction of optical and electronic devices that might well have applications in other fields. It would be tempting to bring those people together as a section of the Hertzberg Institute, privatize them by selling them to Northern Telecom, and letting anyone else collect unemployment insurance. Alas, in the modern world, there are no wealthy princes. Tycho Brahe had the King of Denmark, Johannes Kepler, his Holy Roman Emperor. But remember that even they were hired not for their astronomical research, but for their astrological predictions. Once again, the payoff. So we only have the state. In one sense, the astronomers who work at the little science end of the spectrum can be overlooked easily. After all, what is a grant of a few thousands for research compared with the loss of millions on dubious economic and social programs? At the other end of the spectrum, those working in high-profile photogenic areas of astronomy may fare well because of the patriotic pride that their projects elicit. For example, Canadian contributions to the Hubble Space Telescope, the ongoing shuttle missions, and eventually to the American Space Station will have a positive fallout in the same way as SPAR's Canadarm, despite the fact that much of these contributions are technological and not scientific. Of course, neither governments nor the public seem to discern much difference between the two anymore. Indeed, perhaps none of us can. And we hope that all of Canadian astronomy and space science will benefit when the public's imagination is captured by these technological triumphs. There is certainly a lesson to be learned from the way in which American particle physicists have sold their government on the need for the multi-billion-dollar superconducting supercollider. The SSC has no demonstrable practical benefit to anyone but to the contractors who will build it and the Texas merchants who will supply it. Yet, would not most of us agree that the money was better spent to delve into the heart of matter than to purchase a few more nuclear submarines? The public do have some interest in astronomy. Tens of thousands of ordinary citizens go to planetaria across Canada, although admittedly many more people go to Canada's Wonderland or to the Habs games at the Forum. Halley's Comet excited millions, but we must wait 3/4 of a century for that to recur. Remember the lists of Casca papers. Would the readers of the Winnipeg Free Press or the Quebec Le Soleil find news of these discoveries interesting? Here then is our bottom line. If astronomy has no practical payoff, can offer little to excite the public, and Canadian astronomers are so churlish that they refuse to cast horoscopes, why should we bother to supply them with $32 million a year? Why do we support the ballet, the theater, opera, art galleries, orchestras, mime troupes, historical museums? For precisely the same reason we support astronomy, because it is the duty of a civilized people to support the nobler activities of humanity. Am I suggesting that astronomy is really a form of the arts? In a sense, yes. Why do we celebrate a great poet or a great novelist? Because they reflect the noblest intellectual, creative, and emotional aspects of our species. It is true many of them die in abject poverty, but we do bestow upon them Nobel, Governor Generals, and Pulitzer Prizes, and discuss them in graduate English courses when they're dead. We believe that T.S. Eliot, or Ernest Hemingway, or Margaret Atwood will be remembered still a century from now. Will Stephen King? Is it not the same for Albert Einstein, or Arthur Eddington, or Stephen Hawking? There's a sense amongst many intellectuals today that a profound malaise pervades Western civilization. We were recently warned by Francis Fukuyama that we live at the end of history, which seems awfully perverse in this country at this time. And Gunther Stent, the famed geneticist, has suggested that we are on the verge of a golden age in which science and technology will have made us all so comfortable that creativity will cease to exist. Surely, most of you have noticed during the past 20 years or so an increasing trivialization by the media of almost anything that we hold most significant. A recent poll suggested that the majority of Canadians would rather read about scientific and technological breakthroughs than about politics or sport, but one would scarcely credit this by surveying newspapers, magazines, television, films, or radio. In one sense, though, astronomy may escape the fate of being swept out of the public consciousness by trivialization. Whilst it is true that the public hunger for any news of breakthroughs in medical science, because we are all so aware of our own mortality, astronomical discoveries and speculation appeal to an equally deep part of our humanity, for they tap that eternal longing to go farther and to know more. We are a restless species. We have covered the entire planet and long to go to other worlds. Indeed, I have no doubt whatever that in the coming centuries we shall spread beyond our claustrophobic system into the realm of the stars. The public are excited about the notion of other planetary systems and are fascinated by the idea of black holes, exploding supernovae, and the Great Wall of Galaxies, even if they do not comprehend them fully. The astronomer, armed with new technology and new concepts, has an advantage over the chemist, the physicist, the geologist, or the botanist, for no matter how important the discoveries of those scientists, they cannot elicit the fundamental response of humans that knowledge of the wide universe can bring. In that sense, astronomy can go well beyond the arts. Indeed, it may be akin to religious faith in touching the deepest parts of our psyches. But let us return to Earth, for after all, this is Canada. And perhaps Canadians are uncomfortable with thoughts of eternity and infinity. I mentioned earlier that during the 19th century, the Canadian government invested only a little in astronomy, and only when the payoff was expected. When did this attitude change? It seems likely that the transition took place in the late 1890s, just as the Astronomical and Physical Society of Toronto began to emerge as one of the centers of discussion and organization of Canadian science. The establishment of the Dominion Observatory in Ottawa was the first important step in the new era. William King, the observatory's first director and our first Dominion astronomer, sold the concept of a national observatory to his political master, Clifford Sifton, on two grounds. First, a practical need, given that the country required a central base for surveying. And second, a political need to have a national observatory in order to take our place amongst the family of nations. The evidence suggests that Sifton and his colleagues in Parliament were most impressed by the political argument, although it was never elaborated as such. Even though the cost of the observatory continually escalated, and some of the equipment sought was for that new scientific fad, astrophysics, there was little debate on the matter. In fact, the opposition critics wondered why King was ordering such a small telescope when something more impressive and suitable for their national capital could be obtained. Something clearly had happened between 1882, when the government grudgingly granted a small amount of money to observe the transit of Venus, and 1905, when a full-scale expedition from the Dominion Observatory, along with RASC observers, was dispatched to Labrador to view the total solar eclipse. Being Canada, of course, it was overcast for both events, but the scientific value of the transit of Venus observations would have outweighed that of the eclipse expedition. Perhaps the difference was this. In 1882, Canada was still very much an immature nation, not entirely certain it wished to be independent. By 1905, Canada had reached its adolescence and wanted to assert itself scientifically as well as politically. In the intervening years, Canadians had participated in the Boer War, had seen a great tide of immigration to the last best West, and had finally emerged from the economic doldrums of the last quarter of the 19th century. It was no coincidence that William King's champion in cabinet was the energetic Western politician. The Dominion Observatory, I'll show you William King here, was a splendid institution for a nation counting fewer than 6 million inhabitants. In the 5 years between 1905 and 1910, J.S. Plaskett and his staff had propelled Canadian astrophysics from virtual non-existence to world notice. By 1910, George Ellery Hale, no doubt with some hyperbole, claimed that the Dominion Observatory was already one of only a handful of institutions in the world able to undertake important astrophysical work. This only spurred Plaskett onward to dreams of a great telescope, and with King's able assistance in lobbying, he was able, within just 8 years, to stand at the controls of the world's largest reflecting telescope, a telescope dedicated to producing absolutely nothing of economic value for Canadians. I'm not suggesting that Canadians had accomplished something no one else had. In fact, Astrophysics made important strides in many nations during this period, but few were so small, so young, so rough-hewn as Canada. But Canadians, too, had understood what other industrializing nations had, that support for pure scientific research was a symbol of a mature civilization. Just as the Dominion Observatory was a symbol of Canadian nationality, concrete evidence that it was now a country in its own right, the creation of the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory announced to the world that Canada would take its rightful place in the van of scientific advancement in the 20th century. J.S. Plaskett himself recognized this. Writing to Hale in 1918, whilst planning his first observational programs, he noted that, quote, "This observatory is a national institution, and as such should, as I understand it, not be unwilling to undertake routine investigations if carefully planned so as to give the best result in the solution of sidereal problems, even if they do not offer so great opportunities for the individual initiative as more restricted investigations." End quote. There was no objection from his Ottawa superiors, from government, or from the public. He was able to write in 1919, at the end of his first year in Victoria, that, quote, "It is in such additions to the cause of pure scientific research that the real progress of a country may truly be judged. And if, as often has been said, the degree of civilization of a nation is measured by the support for astronomy, Canada takes a high rank, and all Canadians should be proud of the position their country has taken and now holds in astronomical research." End quote. This is Plaskett at the controls in Ottawa. The routine program of observing the radial velocities of hot young stars allowed him and J.A. Pearce to be the first in the world to corroborate Jan Oort's theory of galactic rotation. This did nothing for surveying or timekeeping, but by telling us something about how our tiny sun travels through the vast expanses of space and time to circle the center of our immense galaxy, it touched our imagination in much the same way as Walter Bade's announcement in 1952 that our universe was twice as large as previously believed. Thus, we are looking at a payoff of a different nature, not one measured in dollars and cents, but one measured in our consciousness about our place in the universe. And this is as important to humanity as the kind of knowledge that Shakespeare brings to us in King Lear. I suggested that astronomers might escape, to some extent, the ennui into which our civilization seems to have fallen. Other scientific disciplines will likely hold center stage for some time, as people around the globe become more and more concerned about the environmental crisis that has been so long in the making, but is only now asserting its presence amongst us. Astronomers have shown no dearth of new ideas, new objects to observe, and new ways to interpret them. The exciting discoveries of theoretical physics over the past 3 decades have brought us to the verge of a more profound understanding of how the cosmos works, an understanding that was virtually inconceivable when George Gamow and Sir Fred Hoyle wrote their popular books that so captivate us in the early 1950s. To be sure, the public do not understand superstring theory any more than they did relativity theory, yet there is no doubt that humans have taken a significant step forward in knowledge during this century. When we think about the research projects of Canadian astronomers, we should not expect that all will contribute in so spectacular a way. Our increasing understanding of the nature of modern science tells us that much of science is routine. It is all grist for the mill. Some of it will provide important clues to unraveling mysteries of the universe. Some of it will perish in dusty, unread journal volumes. But, as Derek de Sola Price warned us many years ago, if we want to double the amount of valuable research, we cannot merely double the number of researchers. Nor can we exclude the work of some astronomer because it sounds dumb to the untutored legislator or taxpayer. The cream of science usually rises to the top. In the interim, we have not devised any sociological or fiscal equivalent of a cream separator to ensure that we obtain exactly what we want, even if we knew what that was. What then is the astronomer's role with regard to the public? I have claimed that the astronomer is very much like the artist or the performer. What he or she does has little economic benefit, but great humanistic benefit. The artist, too, reaches only a small public. How many of our citizens regularly attend opera or symphony concerts? 2 or 3%? Science can appeal to a larger segment of the population, as is witnessed by the millions who visit science museums. The appeal of astronomy must be similar to that of the artist. It must appeal to that desire in all of us to know about the universe, which, in a very real sense, tells us something about the human mind. Thus, professional astronomers cannot exchange their knowledge only within their own circles. They must take it to the public in any way they are able. It is fitting that we celebrate the centenary of the incorporation of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, for this is an organization which has always been common ground for the professional and the amateur. It has a long and proud history of sharing its enthusiasm and knowledge with the public, and in recent years, with increasing media attention to astronomy, its members have risen to the challenge by offering courses in schools and colleges, planetarium programs, public star nights, cable television programs, and popular magazine and newspaper articles. As we enter our second century, we should think seriously about the future of astronomy in our country and the part that we can play in fostering public awareness. Almost all of us have had a fascination with astronomy since childhood. We are the converted. We know, although perhaps we have not articulated this knowledge, that astronomy is important to a civilized people. If astronomy disappeared as a professional and amateur activity in Canada, we know that civilization as we know it would have ceased to exist. Yes, astronomy does cost a lot of money and is worth every penny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jarrell. We have time for some questions. We're actually almost on time. We started late, and fortunately we have a cushion of time at the end of the afternoon, so we'll certainly take some moments now to entertain questions. I would ask each person who has a question to, first of all, to come to the microphone on the side, and also please introduce yourselves to the audience.
Yes, hello. I enjoyed your speech. My name is Tom Harris. The question I had was this. Have there ever been studies which have looked into the effect of exploring new frontiers, or perhaps not exploring new frontiers, on the psychological health of a large group of people, perhaps a nation or even the human species? Because I suspect there have been studies on individuals as to the effect of new frontiers on their psychology.
Well, what you're talking about there is psychology, and unfortunately, of course, with the compartmentalization of human knowledge, we don't talk to each other. I am not aware of any of that sort. The few studies that have been done in looking at larger groups have been usually at the pathological side of things. Why do people go to mountaintops when large comets come? So we do have some studies of that kind of behavior, which is rather unfortunate because that's obviously on the edges. But no, I'm not aware of any of the other sort. It'd be very difficult to know how exactly one could construct a research project of that site, but certainly one well worth looking into.
Paul Commission, Ottawa Center. Perhaps the government could be enticed into publicizing the merits of astronomy. For example, we had Ian Sheldon in 1987 discover supernova 1987A. Plaskett, come to mind the Plaskett star, supposedly at the time the heaviest star known. Well, perhaps these feats that the astronomers do perform are not publicized enough, and perhaps this would certainly put us into the same. For example, in medicine, everybody knows about Banting. All right, why do we not know? How many people know about Plaskett and about these other things? This is, I think, another thing that the astronomers perhaps keep a lot of these things to themselves.
The state, to my knowledge, has never done this in Canada. It has really only belatedly gotten into the business of funding a lot of this research in a direct and systematic way. And as many of those of you who are professionals here know, that gets tighter as every year goes on. And that's certainly true in university circles. But the state has never really taken any active role in pursuing that. We know about Banting not because of the province of Ontario tooting his horn is simply because the university made a noise about local media latched onto it, because, of course, it was a newspaper story that sold. Something like the supernova, of course, is a story that sold. Whether the legislator is persuaded by these kinds of stories is another matter, and scientists only recently are beginning to become aware that lobbying, which one would think is not our job, is our job. Legislators are very busy people. They have a lot of pressures upon them. They have virtually no knowledge. We already heard this morning about their educations. They have very little knowledge of anything. You've got to tell them. And that was my final point, is that this society, in fact, has a kind of unique position in which it can interpret to a broader public, and indeed to the people that hold the purse strings, why it is important to do this sort of thing. Terry Dickinson's kind of thing is good because, of course, we all know those kind of feelings. But one wonders, does Brian understand that sort of thing? Is there a way to get that message across? And that's what I think you can't leave it to someone else, and scientists can't leave it to someone else. We all have to take part in this.
Doug Hube, Edmonton Center. If I may tell a very brief story which underlines a number of points made by our speaker this afternoon. I'm carrying a portmanteau from the 1979 Montreal meeting of the International Astronomical Union, and reminds me of what happened at that event. This is a triennial meeting of all the astronomers of the world, and it being in Canada, a representative of the Canadian government was there to offer the official greetings, and that particular representative was Harvey Andre, who's still a senior member of the federal cabinet. And Mr. Andre proceeded to say how appropriate it was for astronomers to come to Montreal because Canada had a large and honorable history in astronomy, and in particular he drew attention to the important work that had been done at the Dominion Astrological Observatory in Victoria.
One need not comment upon that sort of thing.
Peter Broughton. I just have a comment, and I'm not really sure what you want to make of it, but as Mr. Commission mentioned, a lot of the reason that Plaskett gained recognition was because of the very massive binary star that he discovered in the course of studying many spectrographic binaries. And I'm sure the paper that he published, which announced this discovery, was something at least as dry as those that you listed there. It probably was the spectrographic orbit of HD 2463 or something to that effect. And I don't think that Plaskett ever went out of his way to publicize or to communicate this discovery with the media. Now, I certainly agree with you that the scientific community needs to communicate with the public through the media, but what has changed? Is it just that people could understand stars of great mass and that was exciting to them, whereas they can't understand magnetic fields in BE stars or something like that? Or how do you see the difference between the two situations?
Well, actually, to respond first, I'll tell you something about Plaskett. Plaskett was an excellent self-publicist. I know Peter doesn't quite agree with this, but if you look through his files or his correspondence, he never lost an opportunity to send a cutting to somebody. And right up to the top, when Mackenzie King became leader of the opposition, he immediately dashed off a whole packet of stuff to him, pointing out how important he was, how important Plaskett's star was, how important the observatory was, and why, although BC had voted for the other party, why it was still an important place to put federal funds. And when he was out, he invited him to come up to the observatory. And in fact, got his hands smacked by his superiors in Ottawa for this, but he never lost an opportunity to let people know that they were doing interesting things in Victoria and that the funds should keep flowing. And I think that's a lesson that should never have been lost. Just because there are larger staffs and budgets and you just assume the money will come in next year, maybe you can't always assume that. Plaskett didn't assume that. Plaskett fought tooth and nail for every dime he got. But he made sure that people knew about it. Yes, you're right, Peter. Times have changed. Massive stars won't make any waves. They won't even make it to page 21 now. We've moved everything up a notch. But the excitement engendered is just as much. The supernova certainly captured the public imagination every bit as much as Plaskett's star did. But it really means that the astronomers and those of us who work alongside them have got to let people know about that sort of thing.